Okay, hey y'all. Welcome. We're going to talk about rhetorical commonplaces and communities today. This is a really foundational part of Unit 1 of Rhetoric 306. This is going to set the stage for a lot of the conversations that we're going to have over the course of the year. So these are important ideas to sort of make sure that we understand. I'm going to start by looking at three different images. First off, we've got a Keep Austin Weird shirt. Secondly, we've got a tired SpongeBob meme. And lastly, we have a Make America Great Again hat. What do each of these three images have in common? Well, as you're probably guessed already, each one of these includes an example of a rhetorical commonplace. So what is a rhetorical commonplace? Well, in rhetoric, we define a commonplace as statements that are in wide circulation and are believed, shared, or agreed with by many people. Let's break that down just a little bit more. First off, commonplaces are common. That is, they appear in many different areas, venues, and places. Secondly, commonplaces are shared. The message that they carry is understood, believed, and or agreed upon by groups of people. And a really important side note to this is that the message that they carry doesn't have to be true or not. It's simply something that's widely believed, right? If you think about a meme, if you think about a SpongeBob, tired SpongeBob image, right? That image is widely understood no matter how far from the original context it appears. We all recognize that that's tired SpongeBob, and we recognize that he's engaging in performing the act of exhaustion. So an important thing to remember about commonplaces is not just that they appear in many different venues, not just that they're shared by groups of people, but also that we would think of them as sort of value neutral in that whether or not they're true kind of doesn't matter. What matters is that many people share and agree upon a meaning for them. So, first off, commonplaces define groups and they define communities. If we think about this Keep Austin Weird shirt, Austinites and maybe extended residents of Central Texas use this phrase to come up with an identity, right? It defines the group of Austinites. Austinites are proud of their reputation for being weird, right? For being different than the norm in Texan culture. If you're inside Austin, if you live in Austin as I do, you might feel pride in that reputation for weirdness. You might recognize that Keep Austin Weird is a slogan that originally started as a shop local kind of slogan. You might even be tired of seeing that slogan everywhere. But you recognize that it's being used to define this community, this group that you belong to. However, if you're from outside of Austin and outside of the Central Texas area, you may not care at all, right? At most you might go, yeah, Austinites have a tendency to be weird. But because it's not part of your community, the slogan really wouldn't matter to you, right? Similarly, commonplaces can require specialized knowledge that's specific to a group or a community. And memes are a really good example of this, right? Because we can understand SpongeBob, right? Tired SpongeBob, or mocking SpongeBob, as part of a shared community of discourse that we belong to, right? Where all of us have seen episodes of SpongeBob, we know what SpongeBob stands for, and we get a certain pleasure out of seeing these images from SpongeBob redeployed in different situations, right? But they're commonplaces in that we share a basic understanding of what it means. However, we can be totally fluent in SpongeBob memes and yet fail to understand the joke or the meaning of Super Bowl Selfie Kid. Understanding this meme requires us to know who performed at the 2018 Super Bowl. It requires us to know that this kid took pictures with Justin Timberlake. Being a part of this group doesn't necessarily mean that we're also part of the SpongeBob group. They're two separate knowledge communities, and they're two separate internet communities. Now, is it possible for you to belong to both? Absolutely. But to understand and interpret each one, you need to have specialized knowledge that's specific to that group or community. Okay, here's another example, and this is one that I find rhetorically really fascinating. Commonplaces cannot just define communities, but they can actually act to bring communities together. That is, a community can choose to espouse, choose to hold on to a commonplace as like a badge of pride in their identity. And that's what's happening in this image, right? In 2016, then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton claimed that you could put half of Trump's supporters into the basket of deplorables. And she means that, of course, as an insult. To be deplorable is a bad thing. But you can see that some Trump voters really quickly reclaimed that phrase to use it as a commonplace that actually bound their community together. That's why we have this image of seemingly normal people wearing shirts that say, "I am a deplorable," with pride. And of course, depending on what community you belong to, you might see this image and feel identification with it. You might see this image and find it amusing or funny. You might look at this image with bewilderment. What is going on? You might even feel disgust when you look at this image. All of those are potential responses to this, and all of those, whatever response you have, sort of signals where you're at on the spectrum. Are you part of this community? If so, you're likely to look at this with perhaps amusement and definitely with identification, right? But this is a really interesting example of how a community can take a commonplace and not just let it define them, but actually use it to help create their identity. Okay, so let's talk. We've been using the term communities quite a bit. Let's talk about what a rhetorical community actually is. So in rhetoric, we define a community as any group of people who share common beliefs or identities and who are interested in a discussion because they have a stake in its outcome. So communities define themselves in many different ways, not just by geographic location. We might tend to think of our community as the place where we live, and that's true. That's one way of defining a community. But of course, there are many other ways of doing that too. We can define communities we're involved in by our race or ethnicity, by the generation that we belong to. Are we millennials? Are we post-millennials? Are we Generation X? Are we baby boomers? By political viewpoint, Republicans, Democrats, Green Party members, by religion, by social class. Are we blue collar? Are we white collar? By sexual orientation, by educational status, or by any other number of things, right? By interest, by hobby. There are strong communities around particular music figures, particular styles of music. All of those are ways of creating and sharing a community because you share common beliefs and common identities. Additionally, communities take part in discussions where they have a stake in the outcome. So, for example, let's say that the principal of a small town high school wants to cut funding to the band and spend that money on athletics programs instead. So this is a very controversial kind of decision that Principal Smith of this small town high school is making. What communities will have a stake in this outcome? Well, there's a very sad member of the band, right? Band members are going to be a community that has a stake in the outcome. Student athletes will be a community that has a stake in the outcome, so they're going to take part in this discussion. Teachers are likely to have a stake in the outcome. Members of the school board, the larger student community is likely to want to be part of this discussion. Parents, and even community members, right? People in the town who enjoy attending football or basketball games have a stake in the outcome of how this controversy shakes out. This is an example of a local controversy. Its impact is small and limited. That doesn't mean that it's not passionately felt by the people involved in it, but simply this small town high school's controversy isn't likely to make any waves in New York City or in Houston or in LA or anywhere outside of kind of the local limited region. So the scope of a controversy helps you determine what communities are involved. And this is really important as you're thinking about your controversy that you want to follow over the course of the semester. Is it a local controversy? Local controversies tend to be relatively small and limited in their effects. And the good thing about this is that the communities involved tend to be really sharply defined. As controversies scale up, as they get larger and turn into national controversies or global controversies, you'll find more people talking about them, which is great. But the audiences tend to become, or the communities involved, tend to be a little blurrier, right? They tend to be defined very broadly. So instead of talking about student athletes at Hayes High School, we find ourselves talking about farmers or Republicans or Americans or Europeans. These groups are bigger, and so it's our challenge to find ways as rhetoricians to engage local communities when we discuss national and global controversies. That is, how do we get the people in our immediate area to care about something where the communities seem to be defined as very large? And we're going to talk more about that point in Unit 2 and in Unit 3 and even later in Unit 1. Okay, so a lot to think about in this video, but let's review. We've got two basic kind of things to remember as you're moving forward. First off, in rhetoric, we define commonplaces as statements that are in wide circulation and are believed, shared, or agreed with by many people. So as you're engaging in your rhetoric work, you want to look for the commonplaces that you're finding in articles, that you're seeing in videos, statements that are in wide circulation and are believed, shared, or agreed with by many people, because those are going to help you identify the rhetorical communities involved, right? And remember, a rhetorical community is any group of people who share common beliefs or identities and who are interested in a discussion because they have a stake in its outcome. Rhetorical communities are always the people involved in the controversy. And it's important to remember that a community doesn't simply have to be geographically based. The community can be based in other forms of identity. It can be based in terms of age, in terms of political orientation, in terms of interest. There are many different ways for that community to share common beliefs or identities. Okay, great. So we're going to build on this in our next video. We're going to talk about a very important concept for thinking about rhetorical communities, which is ideology. Please make sure to take the quiz on commonplaces and communities. And next time we meet, we'll talk about ideology.